In December 1943, the fate of an entire front of World War II briefly rested on a single aircraft climbing into a hostile sky. No formation, no backup, just one fighter, scrambling alone while dozens of enemy planes closed in. Far from Europe's headlines or the Pacific's island battles, this was a forgotten theater where losing control of the air meant losing the war itself. High above the Himalayas, a fragile supply lifeline kept millions fighting on the ground. Every flight mattered. Every delay could decide whether bases survived or vanished in fire. And on this morning, that balance was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Why did this quiet front matter so much to the global war? And what drives a man to attack when retreat would guarantee survival? To understand what happened next, we have to step into the sky where hesitation meant disaster, and courage had to act alone. The China-Burma-India Theater, known simply as the CBI, was one of the most complex and least understood fronts of World War II. After Japan captured Burma in 1942, the Allies lost the Burma Road, the main land supply route feeding China. With that road severed, China's survival in the war depended almost entirely on air supply. Those supplies flew from northeastern India across the eastern Himalayas over a brutal air route known as the Hump. Transport aircraft had to climb above 20,000 feet, often through violent storms, icing conditions, and Japanese fighter patrols. Hundreds of planes were lost to weather, terrain, and enemy action. But keeping China in the war was strategically vital. As long as China kept fighting, it tied down nearly 1 million Japanese troops who otherwise could have been deployed against Allied forces in the Pacific. Protecting this fragile lifeline fell to units like the 80th Fighter Group, part of the U.S. 10th Air Force. Their primary mission was defensive, guarding airfields, transport corridors, and supply depots that kept the Hump operation alive. These pilots flew the P-40 Warhawk, an aircraft that was rugged and heavily armed, but no longer cutting-edge by 1943. Against newer Japanese fighters, the P-40 relied on discipline, speed in a dive, and sheer toughness rather than agility. The 80th Fighter Group earned a reputation that went beyond tactics. Their aircraft carried a Death's Head skull-painted on the nose, and some planes were equipped with a belly-mounted siren that produced a shrieking sound during dives. Japanese troops came to know it as the Banshee Whale. The unit embraced the nickname Burma Banshees, blending psychological warfare with their already dangerous mission profile. At the center of this story is a pilot who did not come from privilege or pedigree. He grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, in a household without electricity or running water. Aviation was a dream sparked by watching military aircraft buzz fields near his home. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he volunteered immediately for the Army Air Forces, despite limited formal education and few resources. After flight training in the United States, he was sent halfway around the world, first by ship, then by air, to India. There, he adapted to jungle airstrips, unpredictable weather, and an enemy that often controlled when and where combat occurred. By late 1943, he was flying long patrols over the most dangerous sections of the Hump, defending a supply route on which entire campaigns depended. This was the context: a fragile theater, overstretched defenses, and pilots who understood that even a single interception could mean the difference between survival and disaster on the ground. The stage was set long before the sirens sounded on December 13, 1943. If you're drawn to stories where ordinary men are pushed into extraordinary moments, where a quiet, forgotten front of the war suddenly becomes a matter of life and death, take a second to support the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because from this point on, the warning sirens stop being background noise, and one man is about to face the impossible alone. The mission that morning had already been long. A routine patrol over the Hump, hours in the cockpit, scanning empty sky, escorting aircraft that never knew how close danger really was. When the P-40 finally touched down in the Assam Valley, the engine was still hot. The pilot barely had time to unstrap and breathe. Then the red alert siren cut through the air. Japanese aircraft were inbound. Ground crews moved instantly, refueling the fighter where it stood. There was no briefing, no formation assembly. The runway was already clear. Within seconds, the pilot was climbing back into the cockpit, the engine roaring as the Warhawk rolled and lifted into the sky alone. As the P-40 climbed, the radio crackled with fragments of information. Ground observers were reporting enemy aircraft, but positions didn't line up. Visibility was hazy, the sky layered with thin cloud. Then ahead and slightly above, the pilot saw them, dark shapes moving in organized lines. What first looked like a small formation expanded with every second. Bombers, then escorts, and more escorts. The count became impossible to ignore. 24 Japanese bombers, surrounded by 40 fighter aircraft, all moving steadily toward the heart of the Allied base complex below. He radioed ground control with the coordinates. The response came back uncertain, almost disbelieving. Reports from other observers placed the enemy far from his position, but he was close enough now to see sunlight reflecting off wings, to recognize the formation's heading. He understood their plan before they reached bomb release distance. If they passed him, the headquarters, hospital areas, fuel dumps, and airfields below would be exposed. And there was no one else between them and those targets. The decision came quickly, without ceremony. Retreat was an option, but it meant watching the attack unfold unchallenged. Staying meant near certain death. The pilot knew the math. One P-40 against 64 enemy aircraft was not a fight. It was an interruption. But sometimes an interruption was enough. He pushed the nose forward and advanced the throttle, committing to an attack he understood he could not win, but might delay. The first pass was aimed at the bombers. Speed was his only advantage. Diving from above, he cut across the formation, firing into the flank where defensive guns were limited. Tracers streaked past the cockpit. He saw impacts along a bomber's engine cowling, smoke trailing briefly behind it as he pulled through and away. There was no time to confirm anything. The escorts were already reacting, peeling off and turning toward him. Japanese fighters closed fast. The sky, moments ago, orderly, fractured into chaos. The P-40 shook as rounds struck the fuselage. A sound like gravel slammed against metal filled the cockpit. Warning lights flickered. Still, the pilot stayed in the fight, weaving back toward the bombers for another pass. He fired again, forcing the formation to scatter slightly, disrupting their timing. But every second he stayed near the bombers, more fighters converged. Then the controls changed. The aircraft suddenly felt wrong, heavy, pulling down, resisting every correction. A hit had severed the trim system. The P-40, already nose-heavy by design, now demanded constant physical force just to stay level. The pilot braced the control stick with both hands, then with his knees, fighting gravity as much as the enemy. Sweat soaked his gloves. His arms burned. Still, he kept flying. A head-on fighter flashed into view, firing as it climbed toward him. The cockpit erupted with noise and light as rounds slammed into armor plate. For a moment, fire flared inside the cockpit, then vanished. The P-40 staggered but stayed airborne. Ammunition was running low. Fuel was no longer a secondary concern. It was a clock ticking loudly in the back of his mind. Eventually, the fighter escorts forced him away from the bombers entirely. He engaged them when he could, firing short bursts, scoring at least one confirmed kill and damaging others. But the odds never shifted. The sky remained hostile, full of movement, every turn costing more strength than the last. When the guns finally ran dry, the fight was over. The only remaining objective was survival. The P-40 turned for home, alone again, but now crippled. The base was over 100 miles away. Holding the nose up required constant pressure. Altitude bled away minute by minute. The jungle below rose closer, darker, unforgiving. At times, the pilot inverted the aircraft, using gravity to climb briefly before rolling back upright, repeating the maneuver again and again just to stay airborne. As the base finally came into view, Another danger appeared, approaching from an unexpected direction. With damaged controls and gear already down, the P-40 looked wrong to the anti-aircraft crews on the ground. Guns tracked the aircraft. The pilot rocked his wings, flipped inverted momentarily to show landing gear, anything to signal that he was friendly. Seconds stretched painfully before the guns held fire. The landing was uncontrolled and exhausting. The aircraft rolled to a stop, engines shutting down at last. The pilot sat frozen in the cockpit, muscles locked, unable to move. Ground crews had to lift him out. The P-40 was riddled with damage. The pilot was unhurt. Above the base, the Japanese attack had lost cohesion, its timing disrupted, its impact reduced. In less than an hour, one man had faced 64 enemy aircraft and lived. But the full meaning of what had happened would only become clear afterward. The immediate result of the encounter was not measured in wreckage scattered across the sky, but in disruption. The Japanese formation pressed on, but its timing and coordination had been broken. Bombing runs were rushed, less accurate, and far less devastating than planned. Key installations, headquarters areas, medical facilities, and support zones survived the attack largely intact. On the ground, personnel who never knew how close disaster came went on with their work. In the air, one battered P-40 had already made its difference. When the pilot returned to base, the physical cost became visible. He was exhausted to the point of collapse, barely able to climb out of the cockpit. His aircraft showed extensive damage from multiple hits, yet it had held together long enough to bring him home. He had intercepted the enemy alone, delayed a major strike, and survived his first combat encounter against overwhelming odds. Recognition followed. For his actions on December 13, 1943, the pilot was awarded the Silver Star, one of the United States' highest decorations for gallantry in action. The encounter marked the beginning of a combat record that would eventually make him a World War II ace, with multiple confirmed aerial victories. Within the 80th Fighter Group, the event became a defining example of the risks routinely taken to protect the CBI lifeline. But the deeper significance goes beyond medals. The China-Burma-India theater has often been overshadowed by Europe and the Pacific, yet its outcome mattered profoundly. Keeping China in the war locked massive Japanese forces in place, shaping the global balance of the conflict. That strategic effect was built from countless small, dangerous actions, many carried out far from headlines, by pilots whose names rarely appear in textbooks. So, return to the question that opened this story. What would you do if you were completely alone, facing 64 enemy aircraft? Fear was inevitable. Survival was uncertain. But in that moment, courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act anyway, knowing what was at stake below. And sometimes, one decision in the sky is enough to change everything.